us as Southern people to break down segregation and admit the Negro race into our theaters, into our swimming pools, into our homes, and into our...
Strom Thurmond is remembered today as one of the great American hypocrites. He was the firebrand segregationist who had a black daughter. This was the revelation that came out after his death. We also know Thurmond as the Dixiecrat candidate in '48, the author of the Southern Manifesto in '56, and the record holder, even to this day, of the longest filibuster, 24 hours and 18 minutes, that he spoke against the 1957 Civil Rights Act. We know Thurmond as one of the last of the Jim Crow demagogues.
I came to the United States Senate, a 29-year-old fellow, out of the Civil Rights Movement, a public defender, and turns out one of my closest friends ends up being Strom Thurmond, a man whose background and interest at that time when I came were considerably different than mine. If you had told me when I entered the United States Senate that one of the people that I would have the closest relationship with in the Senate would be Strom Thurmond, I'd have told you you were crazy. Because as Strom told me, he said, Joe, if there has to be a Democrat as president, and I hope it won't happen, he said, it might as well be you. And after I dropped out of the race, he came and said, don't worry about it. He said, you got a good 30 years left to try.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Kingswood Community Center. Actually, that's the one down I used to work. As a joke. You didn't know where we were. Anyway, it's great to be here and back at a place where, I want to thank Wayne Jefferson for having us here at the Hicks Anderson Center. Everybody from Delaware, everybody knew who Hicks was. He was deeply involved in social justice issues and politics of the state for a long time, and was really very much engaged back in the days when after Dr. King was assassinated and this city was in flames. And he was a good friend. And Hicks and his family and everyone else at this center embody the defining story of America. For generations, Americans who were Black, brown, Native American immigrants have always been found they pushed out, not fully included from our democracy and our economy. And it's by pure courage, heart, and grit they never gave up as they pursued the full promise of America.
All right, this is supposed to be Joe Biden laying out his policies for Black America. I'm not sure if he realizes that. But the truth of the matter is that when you actually look through his policies, he doesn't actually have any policies for Black America. So this whole speech is going to be a game of buzzwords where they say things like people of color, minority, underserved communities, that whole game. But none of this is specifically for Black people, but let's go ahead and go through it.
That's the story of the people of this community and of this country. That's why I couldn't think of a more meaningful place to talk about my Build Back Better economic agenda. A bold, practical plan that's going to help build a stronger and a more just and sustainable economy for everybody this time included.
Well, we're starting with the common theme where they list a problem for Black people and then come up with a solution that they give to everyone. For some reason, these politicians can acknowledge the harm they specifically done to Black people, but they can never come up with a solution that is specifically for the benefit of Black people.
There's just a sense, and it's real, that the deck is stacked against the community. The common theme was, how do we break the cycle? In good times, communities of color still lagged. In bad times, they get hit first and the hardest. And in recovery, they take the longest to bounce back. This is about justice. More than 30 million and counting are collecting unemployment checks. Black unemployment is at 15%. 40% of black-owned businesses, 440,000 in total, have reported they had to shut down. And everything is worsened by this crisis.
Now pay attention. When they're talking about the problems, they can say black. He said black unemployment, black businesses. As we get further along and he starts stringing along these so-called solutions and policies, watch how black disappears from his vocabulary at that point. Watch how it's said less and less, and even when it is said, it's going to be grouped with someone else.
Today I'm here to explain how the Build Back Better plan will deal with systemic racism and advance racial equity in our economy. So far, the Build Back Better plan has had three parts I've spoken to. First, investing in American manufacturing and technology so the future is made in America. Under my plan, we will mobilize the biggest investment in rebuilding our country since World War II, creating millions of good-paying union jobs. It includes a historic investment in federal procurement, which is the way government purchases goods and services. Under my proposal, we'd make sure those goods and services are American-made and American supply chains, like American steel for building and energy-efficient vehicles and battery technology and so on. But for too long, federal contracting for this work has been inaccessible to too many black and brown entrepreneurs and businesses. They too often never get a fair shot to apply. My plan makes sure that contractors and subcontractors of color get a fair shot. We're going to triple the existing federal goal for contracting with small disadvantaged businesses.
Triple the existing federal goal for contracting with small disadvantaged businesses.
So it started off as if he forgot that this was supposed to be about black people and closing the racial wealth gap. Then he came back to mentioning black people. Somehow he linked us with brown people. But you saw how he finished that off with disadvantaged small businesses. It sounded like he wanted to say black, but he omitted black. Anyways, so let's talk about this, right? So he clearly states that there's a disparity, and his solution to the disparity is not to exclusively give this thing to black people, but to make sure that we finally get our fair share, which does nothing to deal with the disparity. Now, if you look on his website, he starts it off he starts off the section about this with the line, increase the opportunity for African American owned businesses to obtain or participate in federal contracts. And then when you read this paragraph, minority owned, minority owned, minority owned. So there is nothing that clearly shows how this has benefited black people. Minority can mean damn near anything, including white women. We don't want these type of policies. We don't give a damn about these type of policies. Fuck all this minority shit. Fuck all this underserved, underprivileged people of color. Fuck all that shit. Talk to us about black people. Talk to us about reparations.
The second plank in Build Back Better advances racial equity by mobilizing our infrastructure and taking on climate change with jobs. Take infrastructure, for example. In too many underserved communities of color, the roads are falling apart, street lights are out, sidewalks are cracked, school buildings outdated and unsafe, parks aren't safe for the kids to play in or adults to exercise in. There's nowhere you can go to buy fresh food from miles away. Air pollution causes childhood asthma that follows them through their adult lives and affects their overall health condition. Abandoned homes crush property values and diminish the quality of life in the neighborhoods they exist. But notwithstanding these systematic barriers, look at the energy, pride, and achievement of communities of color. Just imagine if we could truly unleash their full potential. My Build Back Better plan would make sure families in these communities are the ones who benefit from the hundreds of billions of dollars in federal investment.
In too many underserved communities of color.
So I hope you're seeing the pattern. What the fuck is underserved communities of color? How the fuck is that interchangeable with black? Why have we allowed Democrats to run this game on us for so long with this bait and switch bullshit? But in a little bit, we'll talk about where this phrase underserved communities comes from.
The third plank of my Build Back Better investment is in caregivers who take care of our loved ones and our kids. We truly want to reward the work in this country. We have to ease the financial burdens of care that families are carrying. We have to elevate the compassion, benefits, and dignity of caregiver workers and early childhood educators. And the professional caregivers out there, home health workers, child care workers, who are often
Women of color.
I am very pleased to announce that I will nominate Judge Clarence Thomas to serve as Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court.
In 1991, the Senate Judiciary Committee met to consider the Supreme Court nomination of Judge Clarence Thomas. As they wrapped up their confirmation hearings, the committee got word about a former employee of Thomas who had privately accused him of sexually harassing her years before. Initially, the all-male committee refused to hear from the woman, whose name was Anita Hill.
We have hired a female assistant to go on staff and to ask these questions in a respectful and professional way.
What they're trying to avoid by having a woman ask the questions is a repeat of the infamous Clarence Thomas hearings in 1991, where male senators repeatedly belittled and undermined Anita Hill. But even though Hill was the only one to testify, she wasn't Thomas's only accuser.
My name is Angela Wright. I was Clarence Thomas's Director of Public Affairs for 1 year from 1983 to 1984. There's not a particular point where I started to feel uncomfortable with him. I found him to be a man who was angry and constantly said disparaging things about people. He said nasty things about women, often commenting on their bodies. He would often comment on my body, the shape or the size of my breasts, and he constantly asked me for dates, and I really just ignored him because I thought he was just pretty crass. I never walked around feeling like a victim, like, oh my God, somebody help me. To me, I worked on Capitol Hill in Washington politics for 12 years, and that was not unusual behavior. That was pervasive behavior on Capitol Hill. Watching Anita Hill testify, I was struck by her grace and her dignity under circumstances that were abominable.
I felt I had a duty to report.
Listening to her tell her story just made me want to defend her.
When I was asked by a representative of this committee to report my experience, I felt that I had to tell the truth. I could not keep silent.
She was treated horribly. She was called all kinds of names and challenged.
In trying to determine whether you are telling falsehoods or not, are you a scorned woman?
I just simply felt that she needed someone to come to her defense who knew that what she was saying was the truth.
Again, it's difficult, but for the record, what substance did he bring up in this instance at EEOC in his office? What was the content of what he said?
Well, this was a reference to an individual who had a very large penis, and he used the name that he had been referred to in the pornographic material.
Do you recall what it was?
Yes, I do. The name that was referred to was Long Dong Silver.
Have you studied in your psychology studies when you were in school, and what you may have followed up with, the question of fantasies? Have you ever studied that from a psychology basis?
To some extent, yes.
What are the traits of fantasy that you study and as you remember?
Can you tell us how you felt at the time? Were you uncomfortable? Were you embarrassed? Did it not concern you? How did you feel about it?
Now, without saying whether you felt that fulfilled a specific statutory definition of harassment, tell us in your own words, Professor Hill, after one of those conversations, how did you feel?
I'd like you to recount for us where each of the allegations that you have mentioned in your opening statement, each of the incidences occurred, physically where they occurred.
You testified that you drew an inference that Judge Thomas might want you to look at pornographic films.
That was the inference that I drew, yes, with his pressing me for social engagements, yes.
That something he might have wanted you to do, but the fact is, flatly, he never asked you to look at pornographic movies with him. You testified this morning in response to Senator Biden that the most embarrassing question involved, this is not too bad, women's large breasts. That's a word we use all the time. That was the most embarrassing aspect of what Judge Thomas had said to you. How sure can you expect this committee to be on the accuracy of your statements?
What was that incident again?
The incident with regard to the Coke can that's spelled out in my statement.
Once again for me, please.
The incident involved his going to his desk, getting up from a work table, going to his desk, looking at this can and saying, "Who put pubic hair on my Coke?"
I did not expect what Anita Hill had to say. And if I was stunned by what she had to say, I was even more stunned by the reaction of the Senate.
All we've heard for 103 days is about a most remarkable man, and nobody but you has come forward.
There is nothing in my background, nothing in my statement. There is no motivation that would show that I would make up something like this. And I guess one really does have to understand something about the nature of sexual harassment.
Committee will please come to order. Judge, it's a tough day and tough night for you, I know.
Tough day and tough night for you, I know.
Do you have anything you'd like to say before we begin? I understand that your preference is, which is totally and completely understandable, that we go 1 hour tonight, 30 minutes on each side. Am I correct in that?
That's right.
Do you have anything you'd like to say?
Senator, I would like to start by saying unequivocally, uncategorically, that I deny each and every single allegation against me today that suggested in any way that I had conversations of a sexual nature or about pornographic material with Anita Hill, that I ever attempted to date her, that I ever had any personal sexual interest in her, or that I in any way ever harassed her. How would any member on this committee, any person in this room or any person in this country would like sleaze said about him or her in this fashion, or this dirt dredged up, and this gossip and these lies displayed in this manner, how would any person like it? The Supreme Court is not worth it. No job is worth it. I'm not here for that. I'm here for my name, my family, my life, and my integrity. I think something is dreadfully wrong with this country when any person in this free country would be subjected to this. This is not a closed room. There was an FBI investigation. This is not an opportunity to talk about difficult matters privately or in a closed environment. This is a circus. It's a national disgrace. And from my standpoint, as a black American, as far as I'm concerned, it is a high-tech lynching for uppity blacks.
The Senate confirmed, Thomas, 52-48. That is the narrowest margin in a century.
Ultimately, I think they didn't want me to testify because they didn't want anybody to corroborate Professor Hill's side of the story and thereby make his ascension to the court easy and non-controversial.
I, Clarence Thomas.
1 year after the hearings, as more women came forward to corroborate Thomas's behavior, polls showed that a majority of Americans believed Anita Hill.
I was trying to do my duty as an ordinary American citizen, and I simply told the Senate investigators the truth.
Yeah. So the racial wealth gap between white and black America is around $15 to $20 trillion. And what Joe Biden is proposing is billions towards federal contracting to minority businesses. Then he's talking about investments in underserved communities. And now he's talking about home care providers. This is his great plan to close the racial wealth gap. None of it is specific to black people.
Today, I'm laying out a fourth part of my Build Back Better plan, advancing racial equity across the American economy, not just part of the other pillar of Build Back Better, but this is in its own right. To start, we create a new small business opportunity fund. It dramatically expands on the successful Obama-Biden initiative that generated more than $5 billion and $5 in private equity for every $1 in public investment in a small business, particularly in hard-pressed areas. It will also allow us to support community development banks that have a proven record of investing in minority small businesses. That $30 billion is estimated to leverage $150 billion in new financing and equity for more black and brown small businesses. So our Small Business Opportunity Fund supports an investment in a small manufacturer of color seeking to commercialize a new technology, for example. That helps the manufacturer get started. Then private investors, we know, notice the promise of that business and invest their private dollars as well. That helps manufacturers scale and grow. That's how we'll make sure that those with the best ideas are not denied the venture capital or financing they need because of race or zip code. But removing the barriers for black and brown entrepreneurs to start and grow businesses is only one of many things we have to do to close the racial wealth gap in this nation.
All right, so what Biden is talking about is this program called the State Small Business Credit Initiative, SSBCI. This is not a black program. This is a small business program. It's not even a minority program. So let's look into this. They have a report on treasury.gov for this program. It's an evaluation of how it actually performed. Now, the section that we are most concerned about, 2B. This is where I learned about undeserved communities. So the title is Supporting Small Businesses in Undeserved Communities. The act requires that states include plans for targeting undeserved communities in their proposed program designs. Recognizing that economic conditions varied across states, SSBCI gave states flexibility to define undeserved communities. For example, some programs targeted minority or women-owned businesses, others economically distressed communities, still others rural businesses. Given the variety of approaches, Treasury tracked activities using a proxy for undeserved communities. The location of a business in census tracts defined as low and moderate income. Through 2015, 42% of the 16,919 transactions were loans to businesses located in LMI communities. All right, so basically undeserved communities could mean any fucking thing. It doesn't mean black. And if we're going to be real about it, that means they have no clue if any black person actually benefited from this program. And in the best case scenario, even if all of these low and moderate income communities, if all of those transactions were with black people, only 42% of those transactions actually went to black people. And if this is the idea to close the racial wealth gap, where the majority of these transactions are going to go to white males, what the fuck is the point of this? And if we go to this section for observations from credit support programs, the lessons learned from implementation, reaching undeserved communities required focused marketing through a network of lenders connected to targeted communities, which means they were having a hard time with even informing people that this program existed.
Expanding black and brown home ownership is another. Today, American cities, there are a number where about 75% of white Americans own their homes. Only 25% of black and brown citizens or black citizens own their homes. Even in the middle class communities of color, the same homes that exist in the white community are often valued significantly less. Those black residents then see their wealth accumulate much more slowly. Many of you are from families like mine, middle-class families. Where did my parents accumulate any ability to borrow and generate any wealth? In their home. That's how it got built. That's how a lot of us are able to send our kids to school, to borrow against that. When a house is an asset that helps build equity and wealth, the home ownership disparity denies equal opportunity.
All right, so the signal for this thing cuts out shortly after this point. I don't know if he goes into explaining how black people lost a lot of their homes during the Obama administration. Probably not. But either way, if you go to his housing policy, a lot of it is vague and generic. It starts off with the whole African American thing, and then it goes into an everybody thing, people of color thing, all type of bullshit, tax credit. Nothing that is going to be significant to make up for the very things that Biden was describing. So honestly, it is all piecemeal stuff that does not go far enough. They do have some policy about reversing racial discrimination on the local level. I don't see much of the results from the Obama era when this was first implemented, but Trump ended it, and Biden is talking about restarting it. as part of his solution. I don't understand the logic behind creating a federal program to deal with racial discrimination that has largely been on the state level. And within that federal program, you're giving the power to the states to reverse their own racial discrimination. You're not stepping in to forcefully change anything, and you're also not doing the most logical thing to close the racial wealth gap, which is reparations.
Would you then say, I'm for reparations?
The answer is it would depend on what it was and will it include Native Americans as well.
Black slaves, red masters. Hello everyone, I'm Sam Ford. Earlier this month in our 7 Inside Reports, I took a personal journey to look at a largely unknown chapter of black history when my ancestors and thousands of other blacks were slaves, not of the whites, but of the Indians.
The freedmen were either freed slaves or children of freed slaves.
The group lived on Cherokee land in 1942 and were included in the Treaty of 1866, stating they have the same rights as Native Cherokee.
It was during the late 60s and the early 70s. In 1972, a settlement was reached with the tribes where they paid the tribes, I think it was somewhere in the area of between $25 and $30 million for the land that was lost.
Yep, that's right. You just saw him try to use Native Americans as a dodge to reparations. Now, looking at actual American history, that becomes problematic because the natives actually owned slaves too. And blacks were uprooted and had to walk the Trail of Tears too. And then with the Treaty of 1866, the American government told the natives that they had to accept these black people as members of their tribes. Then you fast forward to World War II, the Holocaust is going on, America finds out about it, and then America tries to come back and rethink some of the things it has done. So in 1946, the Indians Claims Commission was created. It took several decades to kind of come to settlements with certain tribes. A lot of tribes are still having issues with that whole thing. But what we see is that there was always a point of contention as far as accepting these black people that were slaves of the natives into the tribes. And when the resources started to come in through these claims, a lot of black people were pushed out of the tribes. So, black people weren't included in this Indian Claims Commission, but then they didn't even hold the natives accountable to making things right with the slaves that they had. So why the fuck would we then turn around in a discussion about reparations for black people try to include natives? But here's another interesting thing. When you look up the Native American section of Biden's policies, he makes reference to this thing they did during the Obama era where they gave billions to tribes. Not billions through small business loans or something goofy like that. No, billions to Native Americans. And yet we can't have a discussion about doing something specific for black people in any regard.
I proposed a criminal justice reform and policing reform agenda that I'm committed to working with the Congress to see it through as president.
So I hope this crime bill, when it passes, the Biden-Hatch crime bill, as it becomes law, God willing, I hope that we will have ended once and for all this notion that is a hangover from the 60s, that somehow Democrats are weak on crime and Democratic presidents are weak on crime and Republicans are tough on crime. The truth is, every major crime bill since 1976 that's come out of this Congress. Every minor crime bill has had the name of the Democratic senator from the state of Delaware, Joe Biden, on that bill, and has had a majority vote of the Democratic members of the United States Senate on the bill. So one of the things I want to do in addition to ending crime is end the political carnage that goes on when we talk about crime. Crime is not Democrat or Republican. Making the streets safe is not a Democratic or Republican issue. This is one of those issues I hope this passage of this bill will be taken out of the gridlock category and moved into an emerging consensus. And the consensus is as follows, and I will cease when I finish this statement. The consensus is, A, we must take back the streets. It doesn't matter whether or not the person that is accosting your son or daughter or my son or daughter, my wife, your husband, my mother, your parents. It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter or not whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I don't want to ask what made them do this. They must be taken off the street. That's number one. There's a consensus on that. The Democratic chairman of the Judiciary Committee, the Democratic president of the United States of America, the Democratic attorney general, the Republican leader of this effort, Senator Hatch, the Republican senator from Texas. We all agree on that. Now, we can find some fringe folks in the study groups on the right wing and left wing, libertarians and left-wingers in my party who say, no, that's not what we should do. But politically, that consensus has been arrived at. I acknowledge there was not that consensus in the 60s. There is today. There's a second thing that we all have agreed upon, and that is unless we do something about that cadre of young people, tens of thousands of them, born out of wedlock, without parents, without supervision, without any structure, without any conscience developing, because they literally, I yield myself 3 more minutes, because they literally have not been socialized. They literally have not had an opportunity. We should focus on them now, not out of a liberal instinct for love, brother, and humanity, although I think that's a good instinct, but for simple, pragmatic reasons. If we don't, they will, or a portion of them will, become the predators 15 years from now. And Madam President, we have predators on our streets that society has, in fact, in part because of its neglect, created. Again, it does not mean because we created them that we somehow forgive them or do not take them out of society to protect my family and yours from them. They are beyond the pale, many of those people. Beyond the pale. And it's a sad commentary on society. We have no choice but to take them out of society. And the truth is, we don't very well know how to rehabilitate them at that point. That's the sad truth. You're looking at the fellow who was one of the primary architects of the Sentencing Commission. You know what the basic premise of the Sentencing Commission is? I know the presiding officer knows. It was the first time in 80 years we rejected the notion that the condition of sentencing must be related to how long it would take to rehabilitate. I'm the guy that said rehabilitation, when it occurs, we don't understand it and notice it. And even when we notice it and we know it occurs, we don't know why. So you cannot make rehabilitation a condition for release. That's why in our system, there's the federal system, you serve 85% of your time. I remember when it was going on, when I was making these arguments in the late 70s, they used to call it Biden's same time for the same crime provision. It's a shame, but we don't know how to rehabilitate. But there is a consensus, and I will cease. A, we must make the streets safer. I don't care why someone is a malfactor in society. I don't care why someone is antisocial. I don't care why they become a sociopath. We have an obligation to cordoned them off from the rest of society, tried to help them, tried to change their behavior. That's why we do in this bill. We have drug treatment and we have other treatments to try to deal with it. But they are in jail, away from my mother, your husband, our families. But we would be absolutely stupid as a society if we didn't recognize the condition that nurtured those folks still exist. And we must deal with that. And I think there's a consensus among Republicans in that. Old barbed wire Republican conservatives just want to hang them high. Even those folks are saying, hey, we got to deal with the root cause of this. Not one or the other, but separately. And liberal Democrats who used to say, let's look at the sociological underpinnings of why this occurred, and we have to, they're now saying, hey, look, we got to take back the streets. We'll make that fight later. So there is a consensus. I hope the remainder of the discussion as we close out the debate in this bill, we can end that old fight. We can put it behind us. Hopefully we have, the senator from West Virginia said this is a historic moment on this bill, a consensus being reached. I think it is, but I think it's a historic moment for a political reason as well. Hopefully we will end the discussion about whether or not Republicans are Neanderthal and only want to hang them high, and Democrats are wacko liberals and only want to look at the causes. Those days are gone. Evidence of that, the Democratic senator from Delaware and the Republican conservative senator from Utah are united in a Biden-Hatch crime bill that does all the things that I just said. When I was 17 years old, like many of you, I participated in sit-ins to desegregate the restaurants and movie houses of Wilmington, Delaware. I came out of the civil rights movement. I was one of those guys that sat in and marched and all that stuff. During the 60s, I was, in fact, very concerned about the civil rights movement. I was not an activist. I worked at an all-black swimming pool in the east side of Wilmington, Delaware. I was involved in what they were thinking, what they were feeling. I was involved, but I was not out marching. I was not down in Selma. I was not anywhere else. I was a suburbanite kid who got a dose of exposure to what was happening to black Americans when I'm in my own city.
You know, when I was a teenager in Delaware, for real, I got involved in the civil rights movement. We have the 8th largest black population in America. Most people don't know that. And I'd go to 8 o'clock Mass, then I'd go to Reverend Herring's church where we'd meet in order to organize and figure where we were going to go, whether we were going to desegregate the Rialto movie theater or what we were going to do. I got my education for real in the black church. And that's not hyperbole, it's a fact. But I got my education, Reverend Doc, in the black church. Not a joke. Because when we used to get organized on Sundays to go out and desegregate movie theaters and things like that, we'd do it through the black church. I was no big shakes, Reverend, in the civil rights movement. I was just a kid. I got involved in desegregated movie theaters and helping, you may remember Reverend Moyer in Delaware and Herman Holloway organized voter registration drives, coming out of black churches on Sunday, figuring how we were going to move. In October, I was invited to the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis to receive the Freedom Award, a thing when I sat in black churches in the east side of Wilmington getting ready to, and by the way, next to two Jewish rabbis, getting ready to go out and desegregate movie theaters in Delaware. I never, ever thought in my life I would be worthy of, and I'm still not sure I'm worthy of it.
We keep talking about this thing as being north versus south. That's not the issue. It is rural versus urban. And most of the busing that's taken place to date has taken place in rural areas, whether it's be administratively ordered or court ordered. Now we're moving into applying the same standards to urban areas.
And it is a standard that doesn't make sense. It doesn't apply. It doesn't hold. We're moving from trying to, in urban areas, we've had integrated facilities but segregated neighborhoods. And in rural areas, we've traditionally had integrated neighborhoods but segregated facilities. And they've applied the same standard and the same test. So this north-south thing is not really the issue. As Professor Nathan Glazer at Harvard has indicated, as Dr. Armour of the Rand Corporation, as James Coleman, as I just held 3 days of hearing, two days of hearings in the Judiciary Committee on another bill I have, beyond this, that deals with busing. And there is uniform opinion of those who testified that it is not a north-south, it's an urban-rural question, a distinction.
But no matter what your intent, there are going to be those who say it's a segregated thing, it's a question of race, and that you have set back the movement of desegregation of schools. How would you answer that?
The way I answer that is I predict that the young black leadership of America will overwhelmingly decide with me. I predict that in 1980 and 84, my position will be totally vindicated by the sociologists and by the civil rights advocates. You know, I come from that side of the track. That's where I'm from. I was a defense lawyer. I handle civil rights cases. I sat in on Route 40. I mean, I'm not from the other side of this. And I happen to think that the one way to ensure that you set the civil rights movement in America further back is to continue to push busing, because it's a bankrupt policy. And that's why I think I'll be vindicated. I don't include myself with pro or anti-busing forces. I think the only group that can determine whether or not a constitutional violation exists are the federal courts of the United States of America. No one else has that right. Secondly, a federal court of the United States of America determining a violation of the Constitution with regard to school desegregation cases must find that there is a specific intent to segregate before they can order busing. That I abide by.
Former Vice President Joe Biden, he's run for president twice before, unsuccessfully. He's never before been the frontrunner. Now that he is towering over all the other declared Democratic candidates, his almost 5 decades in public life are getting some real scrutiny. On top of that list, his record on civil rights during his younger days as a U.S. Senator. CNN's Jeff Zeleny has exclusively obtained some letters written by Biden himself.
Gentlemen and ladies of the Senate.
One chapter receiving fresh scrutiny comes from his earliest years in the Senate, when he strongly opposed mandatory school busing. It was designed to achieve integration and a more equitable education. It was the mid-1970s. Biden favored desegregation, but not through busing. What's less known is how he followed the lead of some of the Senate's most fervent segregationists. In a series of never-before-published letters reviewed by CNN, the strength of Biden's opposition to busing comes into sharper focus. On March 25, 1977, Biden wrote, "My bill strikes at the heart of the injustice of court-ordered busing. It prohibits the federal courts from disrupting our educational system." Biden sought and received support from Mississippi Senator James Eastland, the Democratic chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and a leading symbol of Southern resistance to desegregation. He frequently spoke of blacks as, quote, an inferior race. Biden reflected on that era earlier this year.
They're a bunch of racists. There was, James O. East of Mississippi, Strom Thurmond, and so on. There were 9 guys who were in the caucus that were, I ran against in the civil rights movement.
But he did not say that Eastland and others were partners on several of Biden's anti-busing bills. On June 30th, 1977, Biden wrote, "Dear Mr. Chairman, I want you to know that I very much appreciate your help during this week's committee meeting in attempting to bring my anti-busing legislation to a vote." Then in 1978, Biden again asked Eastland to put his anti-busing bill before the full Senate, writing, "Your participation in floor debate would be welcomed." 4 decades later, after building a strong civil rights record, Biden stands by his opposition to busing, arguing it did not address institutional racism. Most busing programs in America were later abandoned, after bringing more hardship than equal opportunity to all students.
Vice President, I want to come to you and talk to you about inequality in schools and race. In a conversation about how to deal with segregation in schools back in 1975, you told a reporter, "I don't feel responsible for the sins of my father and grandfather. I feel responsible for what the situation is today, for the sins of my own generation, and I'll be damned if I feel responsible to pay for what happened 300 years ago." You said that some 40 years ago. But as you stand here tonight, what responsibility do you think that Americans need to take to repair the legacy of slavery in our country?
Well, they have to deal with look, there is institutional segregation in this country. And from the time I got involved, I started dealing with that. Redlining, banks, making sure that we are in a position where, look, we talk about education. I propose that what we take is those very poor schools, the Title I schools, triple the amount of money we spend from $15 to $45 billion a year. Give every single teacher a raise to the equal raise of getting out the $60,000 level. Number two, make sure that we bring in to help the teachers deal with the problems that come from home. The problems that come from home, we have one school psychologist for every 1,500 kids in America today. It's crazy. The teachers are and I'm married to a teacher. My deceased wife is a teacher. They have every problem coming to them. We have to make sure that every single child does, in fact, have 3, 4, and 5-year-olds go to school, not daycare, school. We bring social workers into homes of parents to help them deal with how to raise their children. It's not that they don't want to help. They don't know quite what to do. Play the radio. Make sure the television, make sure you have the record player on at night, the phone. Make sure the kids hear words. A kid coming from a very poor school, or a very poor background, will hear 4 million words fewer spoken by the time they get there. There's so much. I'm going to go like the rest of them do, twice over, okay?
So I want to ask you about one particular answer from Vice President Biden. They asked him about what he said 40 years ago, and they clarified that it was 40 years ago. But they asked him about how he said, I don't really care what happened 300 years ago. And let's be honest, he said it was in reference to what happened to African Americans 300 years ago. Now, instead of correcting that record or saying that he regrets those comments, he started talking about how we got to play record players to kids.
Yeah, what did you? Colleges and poor parents need to be, basically what I heard, poor parents need to do a better job of raising their children, as if just being poor makes you not a good parent. I was highly offended by that as a black woman. I'm trying to keep cool, calm, and collected, that the vice president couldn't say that the slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, bigotry, institutional racism, and all the hell that black people have caught since our ancestors were brought to this country as slaves on ships is a scourge on this country. And I apologize for what I said 40 years ago. But no, instead, he just went down this path that made it even worse, Jink. And it's just an insensitivity. And not only that, right here on the campus of a historically black college, he said those things about African Americans. We are the only group that Democrats like that can just, I'm trying not to curse here, who can just take advantage of us and just say any old thing about us, our history, and the legacy of that slavery. And it's not just that it's what's happening to African Americans right now. There's a study out that says that it would take 228 years for the average black family to catch up to the wealth of the average white family if we stay on this course, if nothing changes. What that means is that it's never going to happen, that black people are being resigned to a future that says that we are never going to have wealth in this country, and that it doesn't matter if your parents have a college degree or whether or not your parents are wealthy or not. If you are black in this country, that wealth that was made on the blood, sweat, the backs of chattel slavery in this country can never be undone. And you got a vice president that was totally, just totally numb to that. I mean, he just didn't care. I don't even know what the answer he gave. That one got to me a lot. You know, just as a black woman, has nothing to do with my support of my senator. This is me as a black woman in America to hear the former vice president who served under the first black president give such an asinine, senseless, and insensitive answer about the legacy of chattel slavery in this country.
Yeah, you know, I actually think Marianne Williamson put it pretty well in the last debate when she said a debt is owed. Yes. And so when people like Vice President Biden say, I don't give a damn what happened 300 years ago, well, you're also saying, I don't care that we betrayed the promise of 40 acres and a mule, and in the after Reconstruction, that
the federal troops just pulled out for political reasons. Here we are again. Politics wins the day, and it doesn't matter who you destroy to get it. The federal troops pulled out of the South, and it went back to business as usual, and nothing has really changed in a deep way in this country since then. You look at all the maternal death rates of black women infant mortality rates of black children, the disproportionality of poverty in black communities, high blood, health outcomes, you name it, we have it. And so again, to have the vice president just to just flat out not give a damn about it, because that's pretty much what he said 40 years ago, and he doubled down on it again today. Everybody should be concerned about that, and especially the black community, to allow anybody to take us just flat out for granted like that. Not even say, you know what, I was wrong about that.
Now to the race for 2020 this morning, and new backlash against former Vice President Joe Biden. He's refusing to apologize as he faces growing criticism over comments he made about being able to work with others in Washington. But his examples were segregationist senators 40 years ago. ABC's Mary Bruce is in Washington with much more on this. Mary, good morning.
Good morning, David. Well, Joe Biden says he was trying to make a point about civility and seeking common ground, but instead he's now facing some of his harshest criticism yet. And this morning, instead of apologizing, Joe Biden is now doubling down.
This morning, Joe Biden defiant.
Apologize for what?
Our master saw we worked from morn till night, never given human rights. Though years passings remain the same, children born with no last names. What is to become of the American fruit with African roots?